You're listening to the Motley Biz. If it happens in the world, it gets discussed here. And now your host, Adrian Matthews.
Hello and welcome back to the Motley Biz and welcome back to the Kronos Effect. Now I must warn you, this is the second episode of a 3-episode series. So in case you didn't watch the first episode, I highly recommend that you click on my channel and find it right there. There aren't too many videos, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. But for the sake of easiness, I created a playlist with all 3 episodes of this series. In this episode, Luca and I are going to look further into what antitrust and big tech domination means. What are the big companies doing? What are the small companies doing? And, with a new variable, what the governments around the world are doing to control, or rather not control, this phenomenon. Without further ado, let's just jump right into it and discover the second episode of the Kronos Effect.
Welcome back to Kronos. Welcome back with Luca. We're right back. Hi, Luca. How are you doing?
Very good. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. We had a successful previous episode last time. So successful that one of our listeners actually sent me a question. So we're gonna hear a question from our dear friend Oscar, who actually was the second part of the last podcast. Here it is.
Do you think big tech and big platforms need to be broken up in order to promote more innovation?
Yeah, that's a key question. So first of all, I want to say Oscar has a very similar voice to me, so it's a little strange. But to the point, I think that goes to the heart of what we're trying to talk about, right? Because antitrust regulation today has a lot to do with scale and size, right? They have to be broken up because they're too big. In many ways, it's very much a 20th century argument, right? The platforms and the big tech companies of today are very different from the AT&Ts of the 20th century, right? Platform dynamics, as we discussed last week, are a lot more than size, right? They have specific capabilities and also value in their ability to shape ecosystems, right? So, the fact that they can shape their ecosystems through diffusing technology and holding on to data means that and also the fact that they rely on network effect means that size isn't necessarily only a bad thing. So we'll get more to this into episode 3, but in order to spur innovation, it's a lot more complicated than just breaking up a big company.
Right. So since you started talking about that, how do we think about platforms right now, and how do we think about this whole issue? What is the general mindset and the view of people in this particular topic?
So when people think about big tech and innovation, right, there's a number of arguments, but the main argument against big tech, so big tech stunts innovation, comes through 2 lines of thought, right? First, that they engage in killer acquisitions, and secondly, that they create kill zones. Right? Let me just explain those in a second. Killer acquisitions are essentially where big tech companies acquire startups in order to terminate the development of innovations that threaten their continued existence, right? So an example of Facebook acquiring WhatsApp and Instagram in 2014, right? And this is it's an important argument because since 1998, the 4 major tech companies, so Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google have purchased over 500 companies, right? And it's come to a point where February this year, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, issued special orders to each of these tech companies, requiring them to kind of provide information about past acquisitions that weren't necessarily previously reported. So this is being talked about. The idea of kill zones.
Great number of acquisitions, given what companies generally acquired in the past 50 years, 100 years, and even 30 years before the big tech started really catching envergure.
Exactly. So it's a big number, right? The idea of kill zones has to do with investor concerns, right? So some venture capitalists are reporting that, there's an innovation kill zone that insulates dominant platforms from competitive pressures simply because investors don't necessarily see it as beneficial for them to kind of back new entrants, right? So in a nutshell, investors are avoiding to fund entrepreneurs and other companies that kind of compete directly or indirectly with these dominant companies. So an example of this would be venture capitalists wouldn't necessarily enter into the market in online search, social media, mobile, e-commerce.
What does that do an incoming company? What does that do to innovation? Does it harm it? And is there a benefit to all this?
Well, that's the thing, right? That's the other side of the argument, right? The fact that acquisitions aren't necessarily only bad, right? Acquisitions benefit innovation in a number of ways. I'll note two of those right now. So the first has to do with, economies of scale and network effects. So the larger firm, i.e. the big tech companies, benefit from economies of scale or network effects and enable the smaller firm to reach many more customers and much more quickly with a higher quality product, right? So some argue that Instagram or WhatsApp wouldn't be what it is today if it hadn't been for Facebook's scale and investments. So in that sense, acquisition can serve a useful purpose, like motivating investments in new companies, obtaining workers with key skills, and putting technology in the hands of those that can develop and scale it fastest, right? The other side of the argument is that it incentivizes VC investment, right? The prospect of being purchased by a larger company often motivates founders and venture capitalists to invest. Or, technology and business models for search, social networks, and internet, are relatively mature, right? So that means that society is better off if VC investment focuses on other areas. So those are kind of the two arguments in favor of acquisitions.
But if this is how we think about it now, and this model, while it may have some advantages from how you're describing it and from how it is, it tends to be quite disadvantageous in terms of its relation to innovation. So what changes should we as consumers, future business owners, even listeners of this podcast should make in our mentality in order to facilitate innovation and more or less simply enable it at this point, because these giants are starting to take such a big portion of the market that innovation will more or less become muffled? How should we change our mentality is my question for you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think we have to ask two main questions, right? Because if we're trying to tackle the big question of, big tech and innovation, we have to go beyond this narrow market-specific argumentation, right? We have to, talk about investment, right? So who's doing the investing in basic research and R&D? And secondly, what kind of innovation are we getting, right? I'll start by, in order to actually address these questions, we have to talk about something else. We have to talk about two types of technologies: general purpose technologies, GPTs, and enabling technologies. And the reason why we have to talk about them is because these kind of technologies are the ones that lead to spillover innovation for other products, other applications, other sectors, right? So general purpose technologies are essentially characterized by three things, right? They're pervasive, they are capable of, engaging in ongoing technical improvement, and they enable complementary innovation in application sectors. So AI, for example, is having its health moment, right? Its health sector moment at the moment. And we have to
like must really say that AI is having a global moment with the health sector. So thank you, Mr. Musk.
Well, we'll go back to whether AI is actually a GPT in a second, right? Because there's argument about this. We have to remind ourselves that innovations can be products, services, processes, or even an organizational system, right? So some of the most clear and dramatic examples of GPTs in the past have been, printing, electricity, the internal combustion engine, lasers, the internet. Today, a very good example is CRISPR, right? We have to move on to the idea of enabling technologies. Enabling technologies are very similar to GPTs, same characteristics, except for that they're not pervasive yet, right? So they're capable of engaging in ongoing technical improvement, and they enable complementary innovation in application sectors, but they're not yet very pervasive. So examples include nanotechnology, industrial biotech, advanced materials, photonics, that kind of thing. In today's age, there are 4 key ICT innovations that we have to think about, right? That can be seen as enabling technologies. The first is ubiquitous data collection and network connectivity. The second is cloud computing. The third is big data analytics. And the fourth is artificial intelligence. A lot of people are saying that.
Let's take it easy there, because you just threw in some 4 major factors, and I think we cannot just overlook them without going in a little bit of detail about it, especially because they're so sensitive. So let's let's look at a little bit at data collection and network connectivity. It's the topic at the moment. Everybody's thinking, where is my data going, and where is my data actually going? Talk through it for us, if you will.
So, there are four big concepts. Usually people kind of mush them into one, but essentially they're kind of four legs that a lot of these ICT companies stand on. So when it comes to ubiquitous data collection, network connectivity, that's largely what people think of as the foundation for the Internet of Things, right? So, both consumer Internet of Things, but also industry Internet of Things. When it comes to cloud computing, we're talking about centralized storage and software as a service, right, with on-demand and mobile access. When it comes to big data analytics, we're talking about data mining based on multivariate analysis techniques, right? And we're talking about AI. It's everything from neural networks to machine learning, autonomy, prediction, replication, and the self-maintenance of specific systems. So they are all under the same umbrella of this ICT paradigm. And I want to talk about this because it's crucial to understand our ICT paradigm in order to understand the dynamics of platforms and the actions of big tech, right? ICT innovations are rooted in the computerization and microchips of the 1960s, right? Since then, there have been ongoing improvements in microelectronic hardware and software that have vastly increased the capacities of ICTs, right? And it's important to note that the fourth industrial revolution is very much dependent on the third industrial revolution, which is the internet, portable computing, communications, GPS. So that's just to say, you may think of these four technologies that we just talked about as completely new, ushering an entirely new era of digital technology, but in many ways they're very much dependent on the ICT paradigm that's been going on for the last 70 years.
I think everything that we've achieved so far is very much dependent on the history of humanity. None of this would have been possible without the invention of the wheel, without the invention of fire, and so on. So the chain of innovation has been so incredibly interconnected, and it allowed for so much development that it brought the world where it is. But I think it's the first time now, looking at these giant conglomerates, when we see the beautiful tree of innovation kind of starting to narrow down again, which it hasn't ever in the history of ever. People saw something, they innovated, they created, and motivated more people to innovate. It's the first time when innovation can be actually muffled or distracted. One large aspect of innovation nowadays, in the past as well, but nowadays specifically, is financing. How important is it? What does it do? How can you overcome the financial obstacle in your journey? And most importantly, how do you obtain proper finance?
Financing is key, right? Financing, and I would actually, respectfully contradict you there. I think financing has always been incredibly key to any sort of innovation process, right?
Respectfully, it'll make for a better audience, so go for it.
Perfect. When we're talking about financing, we have to realize that financing, long-term financing, is the foundation of any sort of innovation, right? But oftentimes, financing in the private sector is usually too short-termist and safe. So, and this is partly for four reasons, right? Firstly, private sector companies face the pressure to achieve short-term profits, right? This means that they oftentimes have to sacrifice long-term investment, which is the majority of investment in innovation. Secondly, there's a value capture problem throughout the entire economy, right? The question of, will I capture the value of engaging in this financing, right? It's particularly difficult for firms in a bigger ecosystem with very big downstream players like the big tech companies to actually capture any of the value that they finance. The mobile phone ecosystem is a great example of this, right? Where Apple and Google are taking most of the value in the industry. The third has to do with enabling technologies, right? There is no market mechanism in place that can ensure sufficient investment in enabling technologies. And that's why public agencies, which we'll talk about in a second, right, when it comes to R&D, have to step in order to offer those certain and stable conditions in order to actually crowd in some of this private investment. And lastly, there's a procurement problem, right? Because GPTs and enabling technologies develop a lot faster when there's a large, demanding, and income-generating application sector, right? That's why, for example, the U.S. Defense Department's purchases of early transistors and microprocessors were so crucial, right? It avoided the need to actually coordinate and serve many smaller user groups that didn't even exist in the 1960s and 1970s. So this is the conclusion here. Many U.S. industries and sectors, don't invest enough in R&D, especially for enabling technologies and GPTs.
Okay, but who does invest in R&D? Because innovation is heavily linked to R&D, isn't it?
Yeah. So if we're talking about big tech, it's actually very different. And this is the big conundrum here. If the private sector doesn't engage in this kind of financing, why is big tech doing it right now? Because they're investing a lot in R&D. Of the top 5,000 companies in the world, ranked by R&D spending, and that was in 2019. Google ranked number 1, Microsoft number 3, Apple number 6, Facebook 11. Right? And this is for two main reasons. First of all, it has to do with market dynamics. Big tech companies have a lot of resources, and they operate in fast-paced industries, right? So, the markets experience fast technological turnover, which means that they have to spend a lot in order to stay ahead of the curve. And there's also quite a lot of competition, ironically, between the big tech companies, which is leading to the consolidation of R&D capacity, right? And AI is a perfect space to actually look at this.
But is that ironic, or is that necessary to have competition in the creative and R&D space? Isn't that what really drives them, the extrinsic motivation to be better, to be best?
Well, the reason I said ironic is because oftentimes you think about big tech as, too big to actually engage in competition within any smaller players within its actual ecosystem. But there's a lot of competition between them. And this is very, very prevalent in the AI sphere, right? Where the two frontrunners, Google and Microsoft, is a perfect example. Google spent, $400 million for DeepMind in 2014. It would be a lot more worth today, by the way. And Microsoft invested $1 billion last year in OpenAI. Right? So they're spending a lot of money in this. And even other big tech companies like Amazon are creating entirely new markets, right? They're shaping markets that aren't even commercially viable yet. So Amazon, for example, is completely shaping the smart home market segment. So this is something maybe not fundamentally new, but it's something that we have to recognize about the big players and the big tech companies, that they're actually spending quite a lot on R&D.
First of all, because they can afford it, and second of all, because they see the major implication of having proper, highly efficient R&D. But I think it's very essential for the readers and for the listeners and for the viewers and for the very multilaterally developed audience of the show to explain the difference between R&D and science. Because a lot of people, when you say R&D, they think about a couple of people in lab coats in a beautiful laboratory operating on little mini microscopes. But R&D is nothing like, well, it is, basic science is a part of R&D, but it's not the entire R&D process. Can you tell us more about that?
In fact, it's very different, right? Just in terms of the innovation chain when it even happens, right? And there's a big difference here. Private R&D funding usually comes 10 to 15 years at least after basic science funding. Right, and that's those are the initial large-scale investments that are made by public agencies and research institutes. So AI is another great example here. In the 50s and the 60s, research was dominated by DARPA, the Defense and Advanced Research Projects agency in the U.S., and also by education institutes like MIT, Stanford, and Edinburgh. And the Lighthill Report in 1973 is actually shows this very well. The prospects were so limited in the 1970s in AI that there was the first AI winter, right? So this is just to say it takes a long time for technology companies and for technology itself to actually be seen as an enabling technology, and therefore for technology companies to actually invest in it. And this is where the work of Mariana Mazzucato comes in, right? Who, if you would have watched last episode, is a famous.
The way, and it's available on our YouTube channel and Spotify and on our Instagram channel at the Motley Biz.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adrian. So she wrote this book called The Entrepreneurial State. And she argues that, the very early investments by DARPA in basic research during the 60s and the 70s, they laid the foundations for a lot of technologies that are being disseminated by big tech companies today, right? So Apple, for example, right? A lot of the components that make the iPhone smart instead of stupid, so Siri, GPS, touchscreen, microprocessor, and internet, they were all funded by DARPA, right? So she says, by extension, if the state takes the biggest risks in times of uncertainty, then it deserves some of the rewards. We'll come back to this argument in the third episode, but it's important to note that, right? And even today, IARPA, another public agency in the US, is funding most of the development in explainable AI, a technology that isn't yet feasible from a market perspective. And so a lot of the big tech companies are actually engaging in a lot of basic science and R&D funding in this space.
I think the last question, because we're approaching the end of today's episode, Luca, would be: are there multiple kinds of innovation? Is there a differentiation between innovation, and what segment of innovation is the most essential one when it comes to platforms and when it comes to what we get as consumers?
So this is in many ways the most important question, right? So we've talked about financing, which is, just to say, we kind of zoomed out and said, big tech might be spending a lot on R&D, but in many ways they're 20, 30 years late, right? The basic research has already been funded, and this changes the perspective on things. But the second question is, does big tech, what kind of innovation is actually created by big technology companies, right? So this theorist called Clayton Christensen makes this distinction between sustaining versus disruptive innovation. Sustaining innovation is, essentially improvements that are made that make a product better, but don't necessarily threaten the market. Disruptive innovation threatens to disrupt or displace the product entirely, right? So, for example, the electric typewriter was a sustaining innovation on the typewriter, but the word processor was a disruptive innovation, right? And okay, so in order to kind of narrow in on the dynamics of platform ecosystems, this is important. We have to look at two more concepts, which are very similar, right? Autonomous versus systemic innovation, right? You can basically apply the same definitions to these two concepts. The idea of modularization is an important feature here, right? It's the idea that of kind of standardized formats that give structure to platform ecosystems, right? Because remember, platforms don't necessarily only have to be products and services. In many cases, they're also standards, right? So Google's Android operating system, it offers a standard for app developers, which means that it makes it easier for them to create content and apps. This theorist called David Teese essentially argues that modularization allows contributions to autonomous innovation, but it eventually has limited impact unless systemic innovation kicks in, right? So modularity can undermine the ability of the ecosystem to generate systemic or architectural innovation. Because we have to remember, in many complex systems, it's innovation in the system that affords the greatest benefits, right? System innovation enables changes in business models and, spurs those dynamic spillovers of innovation that we see in enabling technologies and GPTs, right? But we have to bring this back to big tech, right? A lot of quantitative research has already shown that big companies, including big tech companies, do different kinds of R&D, right? Instead of coming up with entirely new products, they come up with process improvements, right? If the nature of innovation is kind of distorted towards selling to an incumbent, you're going to get a lot more feature-driven innovation rather than systemic disruption. And this is in contrast to one of the most famous labs in the 20th century, Bell Labs, which is part of AT&T, the biggest tech company in the US in the 20th century. Essentially, Bell Labs research into tech didn't necessarily have any immediate use, but it later gave rise to innovations that were of tremendous value to the telecommunications industry. For example, they're the first ones to look into computer network designs, right? Research today, on the other hand, is both not necessarily very risky, right? They're investing in enabling technology that in AI, where they know it will have an impact because it's already been seen as a GPT, or it's very small and product development focused, right? So there's very, very different types of innovation that you can actually get out of big tech companies.
So I think it brings us a little closer to finding an answer to our question, which is, do big platforms eat their competitors just like the god Kronos, which ties it back into the Kronos effect. Now, in the third episode, which is going to be out 2 weeks from now, actually, I think it's going to be out in 2021 because we're starting winter break, and we're going to let students relax a little bit and not talk about big platforms with complicated words. But are we going to finally get an answer to this big complicated debate in episode 3? And the question is, can we get an answer, or is the discussion more important than the answer itself?
In many ways, the discussion is going to be more important. However, I think there's one question or one aspect of the main question of whether big tech stunts or spurs innovation that we haven't necessarily answered yet, right? We have to, in order to get our heads around that, we have to remind ourselves of the definition of innovation. The collective and cumulative cultivation of new products, services, organizations, or processes, and here it comes, that bring value to society, right? Because we can talk all we want about innovation financing and R&D funding and the extent to which GPTs and enabling technologies are at the tail end of that. But we're not going to address the impact of innovation if we don't explore the value that is created or extracted in the process. So this is going to be the core theme in the third episode. What kind of value is being created by big tech? And what kind of value do we as citizens, not only as consumers, as citizens and as regulators, want the digital economy to be imbued with, right? So that's going to be an additional conversation that we're going to have.
So we know who they are. We know what they can do. Now we're going to look at what they do with what they can do and what they should do with what they can do. Now, if you want a good tongue twister, try saying that 10 times and you're going to be ready for a career in acting. Now, ladies and gentlemen, and Luca especially, thank you very much for gracing me with your presence in another episode of the Kronos Effect. A pleasure as always. Stay tuned on the Motley Biz, and thank you for listening to Rare FM.